Hey crew, before we get started today, as I'm sure you've already heard, Aaron Eisenberg passed away early this week. He was the actor behind Nog on DS9. He'd also played a few other roles in the Star Trek universe. Aaron had struggled with some health issues in his life, but I don't think anybody expected this. It was very sudden, and our hearts go out to Melissa, his wife, and their families as they're dealing with this loss. On next week's show, we're going to celebrate Aaron's life and talk more about his time on Trek. But for now, if you want to support Melissa with some of the funeral and medical expenses, you can do that. They have a GoFundMe set up currently. I'll have a link in the show notes where you can find it, or just Google Aaron Eisenberg GoFundMe and it comes right up. Rest in peace, Aaron. This year and every year, September 23rd is Bi Visibility Day, celebrating the bisexual community and raising awareness of biphobia and bi-erasure. And there's gatherings and celebrations all around this week. You can go to bivisibilityday.com to see if there's any near you, or organize one yourself and send me an invite. We've got Eleanor Tremeer back on the show today to talk about Rejoined, an episode of DS9 held up for its portrayal of a same-sex relationship, and one that has a special place in the hearts of many LGBTQ fans. Just a note, there's a shift in audio quality near the end of the episode due to some technical difficulties with the recording equipment, but we got it figured out, and I think it turned out okay. Hope you enjoy the show. We'll see you next week, and with that, let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I want to know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy. Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and I'm surprised that close-up magic isn't more popular with Bajoran Vedics. Next time you're checking someone's paw, pull a quarter out of there, give them a thrill. I'm joined once again on this episode by Eleanor Tremeer. Eleanor's an editor and writer whose work has been featured on IO9, Babel Magazine, and Geek and Sundry, writing on topics of representation, gender, and sexuality in sci-fi and genre entertainment. Eleanor, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be back.
It's great to have you back. Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about Rejoined, the 5th episode of the 4th season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Out of all the popular sci-fi properties of the last half-century, Star Trek has a reputation as the most socially conscious, and it's a reputation that is arguably well-earned. It was premised around a future where humanity had managed to heal its societal divisions and apply its liberal ideals to its exploration of the galaxy. The original series debuted during an era of intense American social upheaval and racial tension, yet it featured a cast of characters and actors of diverse racial backgrounds, and the show's plots were regularly centered around the themes of tolerance and social justice. As the Trek franchise moved into the 21st century, its commitment to its convictions deepened, and the various Trek sequel series would provide commentary and criticism on many real-world events and societal injustices. However, one specific injustice, discrimination against LGBTQ people, would go mostly unaddressed for the life of the franchise, and gay characters played by gay actors would be entirely absent until the debut of Star Trek Discovery in 2017. But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First of all, let's take a little detour from Star Trek for a little bit, Eleanor. You wrote a series of articles for Babel Magazine about the history of Polari and the culture behind it. Can you give us a quick brief on what Polari is?
Yeah, I did. It was a real passion project, that one. It took me a good few months. Polari is fascinating. It's a language, sort of slang language, that was used by gay men between the 1930s and the 1970s in the UK. It was born out of this glorious mishmash of subculture slangs, including, so Yiddish you might be familiar with. Parliari was the language of carnival folk. Lingua franca, Italian, thieves' cant. All of these sort of subculture dialects coming together, and from that came Polari, which is just a really, really fun social language of gossip and of there are words to do with sex, to do with appearance, to do with running from the cops and letting your friends know where a bobby might be around the corner. And it was so sort of prolific that a lot of British slang words like naff actually have their origins in Polari. So we have a lot to thank it for, I think.
That's interesting. Naff is not a word that we use much over here in the States, but I'm familiar with it. Are there any other like specific terms that came from Polari that are used generally today?
Slap, I think, is a really fun one. So slap is a term that we use in the UK to mean makeup. It actually originates in theatre slang, and was used a lot in Polari, like putting the slap on before you go out.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure, yeah, got to get my slap on.
Yeah.
What did I read correctly that Punch and Judy puppets converse in Polari sometimes?
Possibly, maybe might be closer to Paliari, which is the carnival slang that Polari was born out of.
Sure, okay.
So a lot of words intermingle between those languages. So I think it would be less likely to be used in Punch and Judy, but it was used a lot on Round the Horn, which is a very popular radio show in the 70s. There was a fantastic series of sketches with Kenneth Williams and I actually forget his fellow actor's name. And they were these two men who were very clearly gay, embarking on a series of different professional exploits, and their dialogue was absolutely laden with Polari innuendo and jokes. And even though the audience was primarily straight, and wouldn't have had access to this like secret coded language, the jokes still land. They're still really funny, and I think that's one of the ways. That's probably the biggest like entertainment factor in Polari that made it popular.
That's fascinating. Well, I learned a new word reading some of these articles, cryptolect, which is a word that I was able to put the meaning together, but I never heard that word before. If you want to read, listeners, these articles, I can put links to the show notes on Babel Magazine, and I definitely think that you should check them out. I wanted to ask you as well, it's been a month or so now since San Diego Comic-Con, but what did you think of some of the announcements and some of the sneak peeks that we saw of the new Star Trek shows?
I may have cried at the Picard trailer.
Yes,
oh my goodness. I thought the tone for that was absolutely fantastic, actually. I was surprised. I wasn't sure what to think. I thought maybe they were doing a whole like Logan thing and to make it really dark.
Sure.
But it felt very, actually kind of in keeping with Next Generation, but still very much its own thing. I liked getting little glimpses of the Federation, that bit in the future, and it seems to have a compelling story, so I really loved. I liked the little glimpse we got at Lower Decks as well. I think the concept for that is a lot of fun, so I can't wait to see that one.
Is there anything specific that you are looking for from a Picard sequel series? I mean, you talked about the connections to TNG, but it seems to be itself a sequel to all of Trek from that period, because, of course, we've got 7 of 9, and I'm expecting probably some more elements. Is there something that you specifically want to see?
Well, I mean, I'm really fascinated with the TNG and DS9 era of Star Trek. It's my favorite for the kind of socio-political machinations. So I'm really looking forward to anything that will kind of forward that. It's difficult because one of the things I'd really like to see moving, in that era is how the Federation deals with Section 31, but I know they're dealing with that in Discovery in the Section 31 show,
right.
And they probably don't want to, spoil that in any way, so that means they can't play with it, which is unfortunate, but I think we're probably going to see a lot of Borg stuff, which is going to be interesting, and how they're going to do that, dealing with the fact that the audience may not have seen all of Voyager. I haven't seen all of Voyager, so I'm hoping I won't have to in order to understand Picard.
Right.
But I just want to see where the Federation's at. I want to see, has the sun set on the Federation? Is it still in its heyday? How is Bajor prospering without the Federation? Are planets within the Federation splintering off, or is it only expanding? I think there's a lot to deal with there. But I'm hoping they don't go too gritty with Picard. I love him as a character, and there's a tendency with some of the writers, some of the movies certainly just went really hard in like giving him a lot of angst, and it's primed for that, I think, but I hope they balance the light and dark.
I do too. On topic for what we're going to talk about today, I hope that they have a adequate representation of LGBTQ characters, not only in Picard, but also in the Lower Deck series as well. We got a few quick character breakdowns, but we don't know a lot about the characters there, and I can only hope that the powers that be are looking to extend that representation into the animated space. Oh,
entirely. And actually what I would really like to see, which is what they haven't really given us in Discovery, is showing the Federation as not caring about sort of the barriers between identities anymore.
Right.
While I feel like it's very important to have labels and identifiers represented in TV shows, what I like about the Federation is that it sort of moved into this more utopian space where we can be whatever we want to be. So I'd quite like it not even to be a thing. I'd like for there to be a character who has relationships with whoever they want, regardless of gender, and it's never kind of commented on or made a big deal of. I just want to see that, and any like trans characters would be so important because we still haven't really seen that in Trek. I mean, we'll talk, I'm sure, about Dax and her kind of gender stuff, which is very interesting, but it would be nice to have an obliquely trans character there, but for it not to be made into some kind of special after school special kind of episode. I want it just to be like chill. I just want it to be there, but chill.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It's funny too, because in TNG and DS9 in the late 80s and early 90s, you get these frustrating, ambiguous, for a lack of a better term, glimpses of that sort of thing on TNG and DS9. You have characters who are often talking about, sort of mockingly, like traditional, in our era, male and female roles, like when Riker's going to wear the perfume or whatever in Angel 1. They're kind of laughing at it. But you don't get the sense that it's completely outre for them. Like it's just something that they wouldn't do. And I'm never sure if it's, and we'll talk about this today, intentions from the writers. I'm never sure if it's the writers trying to introduce us to a little bit of this ambiguity in like traditional gender role, or if it's just a bunch of women laughing that a guy's going to wear a sequined like blouse.
Yeah, it's very difficult, especially with TNG. I feel like it's a little bit more heteronormative in TNG and playing with those kind of like, oh no, he has to wear a dress kind of thing. But then I feel like it loosens up a little bit. It depends on who's writing the episode. A lot of unconscious biases are sneaking in, especially in humor points, because like I think that's when we're not paying attention the most when we write that stuff and we think it's funny. Yeah. A good comparison point actually is the TNG episode The Host, which is the first time we see the Trill, and there's kind of tension, but comedic tension in the ending, where Beverly's love interest throughout the episode, who is male, is a Trill and is put into a female host, and there's this scene where there's a lot of tension and the Trill is still interested in Beverly, and Beverly's like, no thanks. And it feels like, is the humor supposed to operate on us being like, two women, how funny and silly? Obviously that's not going to happen. Or is it something else? So that's kind of interesting. But like, I think DS9 kind of moves a little bit away from that and further to the blurring of the lines and the kind of playing, also positioning aliens as being like things meaning different things for them. So there's a male character who's mentioned a few times, very briefly. We never actually see him. He's literally just like a lower deck style crewman who is an alien and has children, actually bears children, and they talk about expanding his quarters because he's just given birth again. And it's just, it's such a cool little thing to throw in there, and not make a big deal of, and just be like, things are different. So
yeah. Take that, the Orville. Well, why did you choose this specific episode, Rejoined, to discuss today?
It's one of my all-time favorites. I think it's really compelling. It's very well written. Even though it focuses in mostly on one character, it never feels off balance, which is good, because sometimes these like character-focused episodes, you can be like, hey, what's so-and-so doing at this point? We haven't checked in with them. But I feel like this one is compelling enough to really sort of drive that story through and keep you engaged. So that's fun, but it means a lot to me personally, because Jadzia Dax is probably my favorite character of all time, maybe. Definitely my favorite character in Star Trek, and I think the way that they play the Trill are also fascinating to me, plus it's incredibly important in the history of queer representation, not just for Star Trek, but I think for television as well. So, yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
Worth a watch.
Well, I'm excited that you wanted to talk about this show on this show. Like many people, I watched and enjoyed the DS9 documentary, What We Left Behind, this year. And also maybe like a lot of people, I don't know, I think I was left somewhat unsatisfied by the specific addressing by the documentary of the show's silence on LGBTQ actors and stories. And I was appreciative of the sort of mea culpa that Ira Stephen Bear presented, but even that seemed a little backpatty, like they wanted credit for realizing that they should have done better, but really they should have just done better in the first place.
I think a lot of the time their hands were tied, and this is something that, oh my goodness, when I was researching the queer Star Trek article that I did for IO9 recently, I think there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that maybe is still difficult for them to talk about because of contracts, but certainly because of sort of professional etiquette. I think that
Yeah, I got that feeling too, seeing some of the interviews. Yeah,
there was certainly pressure from, honestly, as early as the 80s, which I was surprised by, from fans to introduce queer characters to Star Trek. And I was actually amazed it went back that far. There were letter writing campaigns, there were all sorts of things. Roddenberry made a promise at a convention, and then everyone was like, oh my god, we're going to get a gay character. And then the whole thing, it never quite went through in the way that it was supposed to. And I mean, we didn't get a gay character in TNG. We got an analogy in the form of The Outcast, which I still really like as an episode, but it wasn't what the fans wanted at that point. And there are loads of rumours about why that is, and certainly there are execs in charge who could have made different decisions, and one of them has even admitted as much in an interview. But I think DS9 could get away with a lot because it was kind of the dark sheep of the franchise. That was something that when I was interviewing Ira Stephen Bear and Ronald D. Moore last year for the anniversary article, came up a few times. They had a lot of freedom, actually, and because they were, it wasn't a network show because of the way TV worked then. They didn't have to get past kind of censors, so they were able to do a lot of things. And I think when the chance came to do something like this, they were like, yeah, let's do it, and they did it, which I was really happy about.
And we'll definitely dive more into this as we go. I just think that the perception of how the way that people's perception of this episode has changed over time, both the fans and the people who created it, is interesting. Especially in the documentary, like how many episodes did they do on homelessness? One episode, one 2-part episode, and they gave themselves a check for homelessness, but they have to remove the check for sexual identity in this act of self-flagellation. It's like, okay, we get it.
Yeah, I think maybe they were just they didn't want to give themselves too much praise. They didn't want to also not give themselves... It's a difficult situation where you're trying to say the right thing, I think.
Yeah. But I think it's all based around the strength of this one episode and just how it's exactly what people wanted to see. And we'll get into that, of course, as we go. When we're talking about the episode, it's Rejoined, the 5th episode of the 4th season of DS9. It first aired on October 30th of 1995. The story is by Renee Echeverria. Echeveria's first script for Trek was the 3rd season episode of TNG, The Offspring. After that, he became a staff writer for TNG and later DS9 and wrote over 30 scripts for Trek. In addition to being story editor for TNG's 6th and 7th season, he'd go on to co-create the USA Network series The 4400 and produce shows like Castle, Medium, and Teen Wolf. And the teleplay of the episode is by Ronald D. Moore and Echeverria. Ronald D. Moore is Ronald D. Moore. We've talked about him a lot on the show. I will say that his first script for TNG was The Bonding from the 3rd season of TNG, and he likewise became a staff writer and a producer who worked on TNG, DS9, and Voyager. The episode was directed by Avery Brooks, who is... Avery Brooks, what do you say? He directed 9 episodes in total of DS9, starting with Tribunal in the 2nd season and ending with the Dogs of War in the 7th season. The stardate for this episode is 49195.5. And your assignment, Eleanor, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of Rejoined.
Okay. Jadzia Dax is forced to confront her past and the taboos of Trill society when she is reunited with her ex-wife.
Excellent. Of course, no mention of the artificial wormhole, which I think really takes a backseat as the sci-fi conceit in this plot. But yes, excellent.
And science stuff happens in the background.
Yeah, and they are scientists. Here's some interesting facts from the memory banks about this episode. Showrunner Michael Piller originated the idea that Trills would have a taboo concerning reassociating with former hosts. And I think he felt that it would be a necessary facet to their society to avoid a class division where joined Trill would just hang out with other joined Trill, the people they knew previously in their former lives, and they would form an aristocracy of sorts. And when I heard that, it reminded me of like vampire stories where you get like the vampires are just hanging out and talking about, the Reformation or something, and they're treating humans like cattle or lesser beings.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think they were obviously trying to avoid that. I also heard that, and I find that so interesting. Like, Trill society is fascinating because there's such an imbalance of so many things, of power and of proportion of the population. Because I think something like only 10% are joined,
Right.
but they don't. There's something that comes up later in DS9 where the population are being lied to about how many symbiotes are available. And all of this, the taboo is really interesting, and I love the idea that it was try and prevent like a supremacy, an aristocracy of joined Trill. But at the same time, it works very, very well to control them. And when you have that kind of an imbalance where you have more of unjoined, but more of and fewer of the joined, but then the joined have the advantage of history and wisdom and all of this stuff that actually. It's really tense, and I wish they had actually gone into it more. I wish there had been more episodes on Trill Society, but it's fun to get this glimpse into how tense that society is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of grist, I think, for the story mill for future series or episodes of already announced series. It's not something that we, as you mentioned, hear a lot about, but I think it's one of those things where it's like you develop a concept really strongly, and not everything you come up necessarily shows up on the screen, but that basis is there. And just hearing that Pillar was sort of thinking about it in those terms just reassures for me that, like, I think they really knew what they were doing. They just never got a chance to really tell us more.
They really did. And the fun thing I found out as well when I was looking into the idea of reassociation was that they always wanted to tell a story about a societal taboo. They came at it from that angle. They wanted to tell a story that would be analogous to so many things in our society, and specifically it became kind of a romantic one because of the idea of reassociation. So when they were developing that, when they thought, okay, now we want to do this at season 4, let's explore this, I don't know who came up with the idea of making it actually between two women, but I mean, when I was interviewing him, Ronald D. Moore said that it was built into the concept of the Trill from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And there are some quotes from him in, I think, the Deep Space Nine companion book, where he liked the idea of exploring an alien taboo, which sounded very, very ridiculous on Trill, and yet it makes us think about our own taboos and how they're ridiculous. And the best way to demonstrate that was to have it be between two women. Right. Because then we'd be thinking about how ridiculous the taboo was within the context of this alien civilization. Yeah. And then think, oh, but doesn't that mean that our taboo against women being together is also ridiculous? And I was just like, oh, that's great. Because at the time, there was a real trend, because the first lesbian kiss happened on television maybe 4 years before this. Mm-hmm. And then it caused a spike in ratings for that TV show. So suddenly, every TV show is like, ooh, maybe we want to do it. And it's literally called the lesbian kiss episode. Like, you can Google it and there will be a list of all of the shows that decided to do this. Right. And whether it was, tropey, whether it was for ratings, whether it was actually trying to get representation, it was always kind of tokenistic. But what I love about the way Deep Space Nine did it is they didn't even think of that until later on in the story process. So it doesn't, I think it actually holds up pretty well to other lesbian kiss episodes of that era, in that it feels like a genuine love story that has transcended eras, and it really talks about societal differences and societal taboos without it making the societal taboo be the fact that they're the same gender. That's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah, which has been the strength of storytelling in Star Trek and their sort of allegorical approach to things since they began. Alexander Siddig and Terry Farrell apparently had to actually learn sleight of hand a little for the close-up magic scene in the opening scene. And I can't believe that the Ferengi, that Quark is so mystified by magic. They don't have any kind of ledger domain. Their society is so based on deception that they must have something similar to that. But of course, he is completely blown away by what they're doing. Yeah. This episode features the franchise's first same-sex kiss, which of course was the center of controversy at the time. And it was similar to the response to the show's first interracial kiss in 1968. It wasn't until Into the Forest I Go, the Star Trek Discovery 22 years after this episode aired, that the first Star Trek male-to-male kiss was seen on TV. And you pointed out earlier that it's a very tight episode focused mainly on Jadzia. Jake is not even in this episode, and Odo has no lines. He only appears in the party.
Yeah, it's just sort of in the background.
Yeah, just there. Let's talk about the guest stars for this episode. Susanna Thompson appears as Lenara Kahn. Thompson has played 4 separate characters in Star Trek shows. She appeared as Veril in The Next Phase and Jaya in Frame of Mind in the 5th and 6th seasons of TNG. She also appeared in 3 episodes of Voyager as the Borg Queen. Thompson has had an extensive career in film and television, and she played Lieutenant Colonel Hollis Mann on NCIS, and she appears regularly on the CW series Arrow as Moira Queen. She originally auditioned for the role of the Borg Queen in the First Contact movie, a role that went to Alice Krige in the film, but when Alice Krige was unavailable to shoot for the Voyager episodes, she was contacted to take up the role.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And I mean, they have a similar kind of look. I mean, you can tell that they're different, but I read that she was impressed by Alex Kriege's role in First Contact, and she tried to do something similar, but also put her own kind of spin on it in the same way. And it's always funny when you hear actors who are probably just they do soap operas, they do cop shows, they do sci-fi. They're actors. They have to take this on and do whatever it is. But she was talking about how the way that the Borg Queen is nominally the same person, but is like, a clone or a genetic sort of offshoot of another Borg Queen. She thought maybe there was some variance there in the genetics, and so that's where like the differences in my behavior came from. And it was an interesting look at her process.
Yeah, she seems to put a lot of thought behind her work. You can so tell that in Rejoined, the approach she has to the characters. There's so much nuance in every expression, and the sexual tension, the romantic tension between her and Jadzia is fantastic. You really genuinely believe that they had something, that they have this weight of history, and like every moment, every sort of like charged look and slight brush of the hand, it builds this incredible tension. And I think it's because she really believes in the character. She obviously put a lot of thought into Lenara and how she grieved for her husband, and how she feels now seeing her husband as this woman, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, and I like the fact that sort of, I'm not sure how to term it, not indiscretion, but that sort of rift between them gets healed as their relationship progresses. They could just, because like you said, like you can feel the attraction between them, but they aren't like immediately throwing themselves at each other, and they're not just flirting the entire time. They have hurdles in their own relationship and their history to get over before they reach a point where they want to reunite. And I like the fact that Dax has to basically say to her, you were right. Like, I was being kind of reckless, and I wasn't, I got into this shuttle and I thought everything would be fine. And of course it wasn't. And so, that's something that I have to atone for before we can go, beyond this point.
I love that as well. I like that we're getting a glimpse of the relationship, and we sort of learn about it backwards, and they have to unpick it. They first have to bicker a little bit about what happened and have those old resentments surface slightly, even as they're getting to know each other as their new selves. And then later you get this really nice redemption where they both apologize, and it's really beautiful and it means something. What I really love actually in those interactions is at the beginning, and this is something that happens a lot through the Trills, moving from host to host, is that they will switch between third person pronouns and first person pronouns when referring to previous hosts. And in their first interactions, when they're talking about their past, Lenara and Jadzia use third person pronouns, and they talk about the names of their previous hosts.
Right.
And then when they're apologizing and when they come together in this much truer sense, they're saying I, and it's just so beautiful, because you can see the interaction between the symbiote and the host, but also how for them it's not just it may seem very confusing to people external to that, who only have sort of one entity inside them, but
right.
For them it seems to have a lot to do with whether or not they're distancing themselves from their past, and how they feel in relation to their past self. And it's fascinating, but it's so simple, and you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it.
Sure.
But it immediately conveys that they're closer in that moment when they are apologizing.
Yeah, and there's something really, I think, true about that. As good as writers as Renee Echeverria and Ronald D. Moore are, there's no way that they were thinking about it like in those terms, like in the terms of gender identity and that sort of thing. But yet it still works exactly as you've pointed out. on that level. Tim Ryan plays Bajal Ottner. Ryan had a recurring role on the ABC drama China Beach in the late 80s, but he's also made many appearances on television since then, sometimes under the credit Tim Meinelschmidt. And James Noah plays Hanner Pren. Noah would also appear in the third season episode of Voyager entitled Displaced as Dr. Rislin. Noah has had a long career in TV and film. His first credited role was in a 1959 episode of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. And Dr. Rizian and Hanner Pren aren't the only doctors he's played. He's played a doctor at least 5 times in his career, as well as a judge, mayor, priest, and a police lieutenant. And these two guys are, they don't have big roles in this episode. They're kind of there to serve certain elements in the story. But I got to calling them Megamind and Dames Jaren, because I thought the older guy looked a little bit like James Darren if you squint a little bit. And the other guy had a large cranium, like Megamind.
I love Megamind. Underrated movie.
Yes. Let's talk about the episode itself. You wrote an article early in the year for IO9 called How Queer is Star Trek? And the answer was, at least until Discovery, not very queer, I think. Can you talk about the history of Trek's flirtation, pardon the pun, with gay characters and storylines?
I mean, it's fascinating. You have, right from the beginning, you have that gorgeous subtext between Kirk and Spock, which chimed with people even at the time, which is really fascinating. If you look into the history, if you're interested in sort of fandom and how that kind of culture operates, a lot of it does go back to Star Trek. I mean, to be sure, there were fandoms of a kind before that, but what we think of as how modern fandom operates in terms of having conventions, writing fanfic, fanzines, getting together and creating stuff around a thing. That pretty much started with Star Trek, and the first conventions in the US, at least, were Star Trek conventions. So people at the time were writing fanfic about the characters, and there was a different relationship then between fans and writers. They would actually, like, a copy of the fanzine Spock and Alia would often find its way into the offices of the Star Trek writers, and I think Roddenberry called it required reading, which is very sweet. So the writers were totally aware of what was going on there, and it was nice. I think people, not only did people sort of pick up on the subtext between these two characters, I think queer people have always chimed with Star Trek because it presents a really hopeful future where everyone is accepted. And it's rare that we get utopias in fiction at all, even rarer nowadays, it feels like, in television. But it's rarer still to see utopia that you're kind of included in, at least by merit of the concept of such utopia. So that's why people began pressing, okay, then let's actually see us in this utopia. If you're talking about how prejudice has all disappeared, where are the queer people? So that's how that kind of kicked off in the 80s, as I sort of already said, and Roddenberry made this promise, and then there was just so much conflict. An episode was written, Blood and Fire, for TNG, which, I don't know, have you ever read the script?
Well, I have. Leaked? I have read the script, and there's this, this is all going back to this story that David Gerrold's told again and again, and personally, like, I don't know, like, Gene Roddenberry's, like, personal views or beliefs or what he thinks about homosexuality or gay people or whatever, but it does seem that he is interested in good story material, and also he is interested in what the fans have to say, you know, and so you hear that he would go to conventions and people would say, well, why don't we have gay characters and storylines? And he'd say, we'll do it. And then, of course, David Gerrold tells a story about how they were at a con just before TNG premiered, and somebody asked him the same thing, and he promised that they would have an LGBTQ character or storyline. And David Gerrold goes off and writes Blood and Fire, an episode that isn't even about gay characters. Like, it features two, like, side characters that are gay characters, and of course that just blew everything up.
Yeah, the plot was also an analogy for the AIDS crisis, and I think that was also what some people within the production were not comfortable with. And Gerald felt very strongly about it. He even wanted to put a card at the end of the episode that invited people to donate blood, because it was all about regular bloodworms. Honestly, nowadays, looking at the episode, you can read it and think, oh my God, this is so on the nose. But, I mean, it was season 1 of TNG. I mean, have you seen season 1 of TNG?
Yeah.
It was certainly at least a decent episode for season 1, and could have been made even better had it made it to air. But it never did.
Yeah, and I don't want to bury anybody who doesn't deserve it, but if they do, then let's do it. But you hear different theories about who had a problem with it. It's easy to say the network, but as far as specific people, we don't know. I'm sure we can say that Leonard Maislish was against it, though. Nobody has a problem burying him.
Oh, my goodness, yes. I mean, Gerald has talked about how difficult he felt like it was a very toxic work environment, and that Maislish made it even more toxic.
I've heard David Gerald's a great interview. I've heard more measured responses from him, and then I've heard somebody just set him to 10 because I heard a very vociferous sort of response to that situation as well. But it sounds like it wasn't fun for some people to work in those early days of TNG.
No, not at all. And I think there were people who stayed in some of them sort of left, some of them quit. But I think there were people that stayed in positions of power who were a little bit more cautious, let's say. That would be a very generous way of saying it. I mean, Rick Berman, when, later on, when The Outcast came out, and he is quoted actually literally a month later, I think, in a magazine saying how he felt like had they cast a male actor in the role of Riker's love interest, that a kiss between them would have been unpalatable for viewers. He's very, very concerned in all of his quotes about how queer representation would affect viewership, and it's difficult to know whether just like how much of a factor that was in his decision. Clearly a huge one, but it was certainly, there were a lot of roadblocks for writers moving forward.
Yeah, and when Jerry Taylor wrote the episode The Outcast, then I have to imagine that she just didn't come up with this sci-fi idea about a planet of people who were sort of genderqueer. Like she must have had that on her mind, and then to submit it to the producers in charge and have them say, well, we can't do this, or it definitely has to be a female actress that plays the role of Soren. I just wonder, like, there must be some great hot take interviews with Jerry Taylor somewhere, or maybe she just wants to doesn't want to screw up her promotion. But it has to be really frustrating to be a writer in a situation like this, come up with these great ideas, and if you're somebody like Ronald D. Moore, I've heard him go both ways, because I've heard him say, like I've heard a lot of the people behind the scenes say, that it was never about gay characters, something like Rejoined. And then I've also heard them say, we had to sneak it through. It was tough, but we got it through. And I'm not sure if that's just like revisionism, or if it's just, as you mentioned before, people who are now out from under the umbrella of a contract or free to say more. But like, when you look at people's interviews from the time, even interviews with people like Terry Farrell, there's this weird insistence about it not being gay, or that like being completely ancillary to what they're trying to accomplish. And the legacy of this episode is that was everything that was accomplished by the episode.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to say. I think they didn't want it to be labelled as the gay episode. They wanted it to be more complex than that.
And they failed, because that's exactly what it is now today.
But the thing is, but it always was. If it's going to be about a societal taboo, that's what it's about. Like,
yeah.
I think that it's very difficult for people when they're put on the spot to immediately come out with what people want to hear. But I think it means different things to different people. For Terry Farrell, I think it was a really interesting episode for her character and her character's development, which it certainly is.
Yeah.
For the writers, it was a chance for them to deal with a lot of interesting societal tensions and issues that were analogous to the ones we still have, and then also provide representation, and you get different sides of that story. One of the things I love about this episode is because it works on all these multifaceted levels, and you get people who say, oh, but it's another queer story using aliens as an analogy, don't you see that that's problematic? And I'm like, well, yes and no. I think that it allowed them to tell a story that was inherently queer in terms of it being about, being prevented from loving someone, but without actually introducing the idea of homophobia to the Federation, and no one wants that. And actually, there's a fantastic conversation between Kira and Bashir, which lasts maybe 45 seconds, probably a little bit longer than that, early on in the episode, where they're just talking about Lenara and Jadzia and them having this history. Never once do they bring up the fact that they're both the same gender, and what that establishes is that same gender relations are not they're not thought of as being weird or problematic at all in either the Federation or Bajoran society. And that is something really tiny but crucial that episode establishes. So it kind of, it's a win-win. You get to tell a story that the sort of your queer viewers will chime with about these things that they're dealing with, but then also show that love between two women is so fine it's not even thought of as being not fine. And I'm like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, we get that scene between Kira and Bashir where they're kind of laying it out. And there are a couple scenes in this episode that are like kind of densely expositional, but they're required, I guess, if you're just coming in. You have to understand, you know, who Dax is and what her life has been like. But I like the fact that Kira's just like, so they're going to get together? And Bashir's like, I don't think they can. And you're waiting for the shoe to drop, but it's the fact that the Trills have this, you know, this weird taboo, and it's never even questioned. In fact, Kira, if she was in this situation, she would go for it because Kira just bucks all trends and traditions. But I love the fact that, they never even questioned the fact that it's two women. I just think it's crazy that the show just would let that opportunity to slip by to twist the knife a little bit. You know, I get that they were avoiding sensationalism. If you believe Rick Berman, you know, they'd get canceled if they did it or whatever. I know they didn't want to be misunderstood. Something else that I've run into just reading on the internet about people's responses, quotes from the writers, the actors at the time. I think that maybe we're getting a skewed picture of the past because the people who write Memory Alpha are fans, and fans have a really weird insistence on eliminating the quote-unquote gayness from this episode. Which is, you know, you see endlessly on Facebook or Reddit or whatever, you know, the worms are genderless, man. It's not two women in love, which is even crazier because they can understand two genderless or genderqueer, like, worm characters being in love. But if two women are, forget about it. Like, if anything, this episode obliterates gender.
Yeah. Isn't that more progressive?
You're right.
That's a really fun thing, actually, that I think about a lot with, like, the Outcast and with Jadzia Jax as a character, is that this has aged so well. It's actually become more progressive with age, because at the time they were using gender to be analogous for, like, sexuality. But now we're like, no, the idea of someone changing gender is actually even more kind of like taboo than the idea of like same-sex relationships. So we can look at Dax now and think, oh, well, this is a arguably gender fluid individual who, you know, switches gender, and you can see how gender norms are kind of dealt with through her saying, you know, like, don't, in Blood Ties, she says, if it to one of her old Klingon mates, and they're having a battle, and she says, you know, don't go easy on me. If it helps, think of me as a man. I've been one several times. And it's like,
right.
That's awesome. That's such a fun thing. And people who critique it and say, oh, but they're not really gendered at all. And it's like, oh, so you accept that non-binary genders are a thing? And they probably be like, oh, wait, no. Backpedal.
I've heard people make comparisons to Plato's Stepchildren, that, like, Plato's Stepchildren features an interracial kiss, but it's not about interracial relationships, which is crazy because Plato's Stepchildren is about psychic Greek weeaboos. Like, if Kirk and Uhura spent the entire episode trying to kiss each other or not trying to kiss each other, and then they were, like, forced to, it might be about interracial romance. But instead, it's an episode about the landing party actually being pretty nice and respectful to a little person.
Exactly, yeah. These things can be seen from so many different perspectives, which is fun because, you know, it's sci-fi and aliens would always be that analogy. But like, you'll see that in Rejoined as well, where you could say, well, when Lenara and Jadzia, when Dax and Kahn were originally together, it was a heterosexual relationship. So that helps the specifically the sort of the straight people in the audience understand their romance now, because it's like, oh yeah, but they used to be straight, so this is obviously just a hangover. But at the same time, doesn't that also show that love transcends gender? And so that's also kind of a cool thing.
Nobody would ever talk about Let That Be Your Last Battlefield and with a straight face trying to say that it's just about people who have half black on one side and half white on the other side of their faces. Like, they can understand the metaphor there, but, you know, fandom sometimes. I don't know. In my opinion, this always had to be about two women. It's the only way that it really works. Like, otherwise, if Lenara was a male or a man character, as they originally had planned to do, it's just one more one-off boyfriend for Dax. And Trek has always dealt in allegory, and the Trill's prescription on reassociation doesn't have any resonance if it's not standing in for discrimination in our own society.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of whether she was originally written as male or female. It's difficult to put the finger on because I've heard rumors that she was originally male in the script and then later was changed to female, but I don't know. There are later quotes that say that they intended from the beginning for her to be a woman. But Dax is a fun character because she's kind of a stud, you know. She has lots of little trysts and stuff, and then after this episode and the next season, you see another one of sort of her ex-flings who also is a woman, and it's one of Curzon's ex sort of girlfriends. I did write the episode name down. It's in season 5. It's Let He Who Is Without Sin. She and Worf are together at that point, so they go to Riser for some fun. And along comes Curzon's ex, and Worf gets all kind of worried because Jadzia is pretty flirtatious with her. And that's fun because then they didn't have to make an episode about taboo. They could just be like, yep, see, Jadzia likes... she kind of likes girls.
Yeah, and it's put on Worf, too, that it's sort of his uptightness. Like, it's not... We do see that it is a facet of Dax's character, that she is a romantic, and she loves and loses and has had, you know, different partners and stuff like that. But it's never... I just feel like on a sitcom, I don't know, Friends, if Ross starts dating a girl and he finds out that she dated, 30 guys before him, that would be a big problem for Ross to get over, and we're supposed to, like, sympathize with him. But instead, it's like we understand who Dax is at this point, and we accept her as being this way, and it's really Worf who is the villain of the episode, because, of course, he starts screwing with the weather or whatever. It's kind of a weird episode, but
it's very strange.
Could this episode, Rejoined, only happen on DS9?
I mean, I'm a huge Deep Space Nine fan, so I would say yes.
You're going to say yes.
But I think also objectively, yes. I think Deep Space Nine, from the beginning, was all about shirking the conventions of the past within Star Trek itself. You got Ira Stephen Bear, who, he said to me in the interview that I did for the anniversary thing, and he's probably said this to other people as well, that he never really believed in the idea of the Federation as a utopia. That to him it was just a little bit too simple, a little bit too easy, and he was interested in showing a more complex, what he saw as a more complex story. And Ronald D. Moore is very interested in people and characters and cultures, and Michael Piller and René Echevarria, the other sort of writers who are involved in Deep Space Nine, I think they wanted to tell a story about sort of international politics and show a glimpse of the universe outside the Federation, and with that came a whole lot of colourful and shifting perspectives, and dealing with what happens when your values and your worldviews clash with someone else's, and finding the midpoint between that. So even though shows like TNG and Voyager and the original series dealt with a lot of like thought experiment episodes or like social analogy episodes, they always felt to me, I mean, TNG is really, really good and has moments where it hits very, very hard. Yeah. But sometimes it feels a little bit like it is kind of like, we're going to talk about this concept now and let's think about it, which is great and I enjoy. Right. But in Deep Space Nine, it feels a lot more kind of shades of grey, a lot more kind of natural. Like, right. let's explore the weird stuff that happens when people try and form a society. And then also the fact that it was the Dark Sheep, and they had maybe a little bit more freedom, and they wanted to push the envelope, so they did. And they were a few years, later on than Next Generation. Yeah. Having said that, though, Voyager never had any queer characters. So
yeah.
And Enterprise, oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, less said the better. I disagree. Well, that's fascinating. Just what you said about the way that some of those premier writers of the show want to challenge or don't believe in the utopia, and you see that in like Battlestar Galactica, for instance, Moore's other work. I kind of agree and disagree with them because for me, the biggest fiction of a universe like Star Trek isn't warp drive, it isn't replicators. It's the fact that we live in a utopia. It's the fact that we have, quote unquote, solved our problems. And of course, not all of them, but enough to the point where we can function as this egalitarian society. But that's kind of like what I'm there for. That's kind of what I'm buying into. And it's true that original series was more, we're perfect. We fly to a planet where they let a computer tell them how many people they have to kill, to make this war make sense or whatever. That's, commentary on other societies or bad societies, whereas as Trek goes on later, we're more willing to look at the problems in our own society. But I don't think that we have to mess up the Federation or let the Federation fall in order to really explore relevant topics, for humanity. I'm a big fan of the late science fiction author Ian M. Banks, and his books are centered around a society that's very similar to the Federation. It's a anarchistic utopian society called The Culture, and he wrote I can't remember how many books, maybe 7 or 8 books about the culture. And in fandom, we're always the discussion in fandom is always when is he going to write a book about the fall of the culture? When's the culture going to fall apart? And my opinion was always why would the culture ever fall apart? They've lasted for almost 1,000 years in the span of his books, and they evolve and things change. And as a nation, they're very laissez-faire about how the structure of their nation, you can be a part of the culture if you say you are. People break off from the culture, they come back. It's this sort of different idea of a state. I think that we have an idea of what a state or a country has to be, and so we put that on the Federation. And to be fair, the Federation was developed by a guy who fought in World War II. He was, had very traditional ideas about it. But it's I don't think we need to I'm tired of bad morals, and I'm tired of there always being a conspiracy in the Federation, and that's how we really get reflective in our Star Trek storytelling.
I totally agree. I adore the idea of utopia. I think that it's actually a much more interesting storytelling device than people give it credit for, simply because people don't give it credit for being an interesting story device. Why do we think a utopia is boring? Is it actually because it's a real challenge to write? I've thought a lot about this, and I'm I want to see more utopias, and I want to see utopias that are perfect in how that they and the way that they're perfect really challenges how we see our society, because we see how it's different from the society we have now, and that's the reason that it works better. That's actually very challenging. But I love that, and I want to see more of that, and I want to see the new Star Trek shows really embrace that, because I feel Deep Space Nine actually told quite a good story about the Federation in showing the contrast to it, and showing that you still have to remain vigilant no matter how much you think you've created a utopia. You cannot be complacent. Yeah. And it was really good in showing the nuances of that, even though Section 31 isn't resolved in that show. But I see things like Discovery. They wanna be the edgy show. They wanna appeal to modern viewers, and the way they're doing that is by doing a darker show than The Next Generation, and by this sort of sunny side of the Federation. But at the same time, they're not challenging the Federation. Deep Space Nine was a grittier show, it was a darker show comparatively to the other shows in the franchise, because it challenged the Federation, because it said, okay, here are the limits, and here is the arrogance, and here's the hypocrisy, and here's how we're trying to better it. Discovery just has arrogance and hypocrisy there and never deals with it. It never really properly challenges it, and the way that Section 31 is portrayed in that show, I'm kind of concerned about, because they glamorize it. They're here's the cool spy side of things. Let's never talk about this again, because plot. And it's what are you saying here?
Yeah.
They want it to be darker, but they don't want to actually deal with what that means, is my issue with Discovery.
Yeah, people forget that, when we see Sloan meet his end, he's brain dead on a table, basically, and they're having to try to ransack his brain for secrets because he wouldn't share anything with anybody else. You mentioned the episode, which I can't remember the name of it now, from TNG before, that featured the first Trill. The host, that's right. And the fact that at the end of the episode, Onan and a new host comes to Bev to sort of restart their relationship, and she's like, I don't think so. And you said that it's played for comedy. I guess I never saw comedy there. I was always worried about, I was always just wondering about the clear discomfort that you see in Beverly's face, and wondering if they were trying to communicate, well, there's no way that I can go forward with this because this is a female now, or if it's just, your boyfriend is also a girlfriend, is also an alien, if it was too weird for that reason, or I was wondering what they were really trying to say, if they were trying to say something specific with that. And if Bev is not bisexual, that's totally fine, but that doesn't have, I think, quite a a positive modern reading today as something like Rejoined does.
No, yeah, the ambiguity there actually doesn't do it any favours at all, because it's so easy to watch it through a heteronormative lens and be like, haha, of course, it's kind of a no homo. It's like, oh, I'm good, thanks, even though we shared a lot and I said I loved you. I don't like this.
And I was cool when you were Riker. That was fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, it's not dealt with very well. It's not dealt with at all. I think that's the issue. I think if they had actually said, you know, if she had said, actually, thanks, but you're not my type, or actually, I find it very difficult to deal with the fact that you're a different person now and we said goodbye and I don't know what that means and it's just, you know, it's just a bit too alien for me. That would have been interesting, because then we could have said, okay, yeah, clearly this is just Beverly's sexual preferences, or, oh, interesting, so Beverly actually has some issues with kind of like alien interaction, and the idea of the Trill is very interesting if you think about how they're human, if they have a romance with humans, how humans would deal with the fact that their love of their life or whatever is dead, but still going on, but slightly different. Like, that's really complex, and that's something that you kind of see with Worf and Ezri, but I don't know. I feel like season 7 leaves me cold in some ways because of how it just falls a little bit flat for me. But you know that's still there, you know.
Yeah, I'm interested in your opinion about that, the connection between Worf and Ezri, because it feels to me like, you know, they knew at that point they had only 1 year left, and they bring this new character on, and so they sort of fast forward through the acceptance and denial and anger and all the other steps of the Kubler-Ross scale, because they have Worf and Ezri sort of hook up again, and then immediately sort of be like, well, that's not going to be a thing, and then eventually they end up in a place where she's, you know, I think they're very close friends. She's very instrumental in actually convincing him to kill Gowron. So they do end up in a good place. But yeah, I think I'd agree that it's not handled well. And I think the problem is that they just sort of ran out of time.
Yeah, they did. And that's the kind of relationship development that would have taken years, both in show and sort of within the canon, and then also in like it should have taken seasons, at least 2 seasons, to deal with this plot. And then so they rushed through that. They kind of go through the motions. I think having them sleep together was an odd idea. I think they just shouldn't have done that, because they never dealt with Worf's grief in a way that was proper as well. Like, it kind of undermines what Jadzia meant to him and the show in general, which is a really uncomfortable space to be in. And then they're like, oh yeah, and Bashir and Ezri really love each other. Look at them. They're so happy.
That was
and
really
it's like,
fast.
What, they interacted like twice. What's going on?
Yeah.
And then bringing up Bashir's crush on Jadzia again. I really hate that, because like it's there in the beginning, and then they become really good friends, and they have a fantastic dynamic, and they're really actually very similar, but they contrast in nice ways, and seeing their friendship is really fun.
They're doing magic tricks together. And
yeah, it's cute. It's cute. And they're kind of each other's wingman at some point.
Right.
And then the writers are like, oh, but they were secretly in love the whole time. And it's like, no.
With 50 years of Trek storytelling, why didn't Trek get it right until now, until Discovery?
I wouldn't say it's got it right now, to be honest.
Interesting. Okay. Go on.
I mean, I'm back on my...
I mean, at least we've got gay actors playing gay characters.
Sure.
I mean,
and
we've got that.
God, I mean, I love Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz. They're incredible. I mean, I love Rent, so I'm like, yes. They've each done so much for representation, and they're both activists in a way. I know Wilson Cruz is very invested in activism as well. So it's hugely important that not only gay characters are on Discovery, but that it's portrayed by gay actors, and these specific gay actors. I think they're fantastic at what they do. But at the same time, I'm back. Here I am with my unpopular Discovery opinions. I feel like their relationship in season 1, I quite liked it. It was it felt quite natural. They were a married couple, and it was very sweet. And there was clearly, they were working with the fact that Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz have worked together before, because they bring this like gravity of history. But I feel like obviously the way they handled the death was weird, and then the way they brought him back was even weirder. I really didn't like the way they sort of did do that in season 2 with him coming back, and oh my goodness, I think it was a mess, to be honest. And I think it's also kind of sad that this is the only representation that we've had so far in Discovery, that it's like, oh, okay, great, you've got these two guys who are in love, that's fantastic, but it's just them, and they're married, and no one else is kind of seen to be queer at all.
Yeah.
They have a couple of background lesbians in the Time Loop episode in season 1 where they're dancing in the background, and I'm like, that's great. That's great. Have that more. Have it be more fluid. Have it be more accepted. And there's this weird scene where in season 2 where Giorgio, who seems to be bisexual, if we go by a blink and you miss it scene in at the end of season 1 where she seems to have a tryst with a male and a female Orion. So I'm like, okay, she's bisexual. That's in my head now. You can't take that away, Discovery. And then you have her weirdly coming on to Stamets and being like, oh, well, in my dimension, you were pan and we had sex. And he's like, well, in this and every dimension, I'm gay, so go away. And it was just such a weird scene. I was like, what am I watching?
I don't know. I think it's like a hard turn. I mean, we've talked about this before, but it's like a hard turn into the kind of depraved bisexual sort of trope, which I feel like if you want to give that scene the benefit of the doubt, they are playing into. Like, she is, playing up that in order to discomfit them, and sort of stand out. But it's still like, that's a lot of nuance for a typical TV audience.
Yeah, it's difficult to say whether they're subverting the trope or doing the trope. Right now, they're just doing the trope. I adore her as a character, though, and I think, bisexuality is so difficult to portray. I mean, we were talking about the clash between kind of like gay male representation and lesbian representation, but bisexual representation is also very, very difficult to handle, and the term bisexual barely ever gets uttered. In Orange is the New Black, you have a protagonist who is bisexual, and they refuse to say the word until literally this season. They finally use that word to describe her. They shirk it at every opportunity. She's like, oh, I don't like labels. And it's like, okay. That only really gets you so far. And so I quite like them to. They've got an opportunity here with Giorgio to undermine our values, to say, hey, you think of this as being the way things are. Well, she's from the mirror universe, and she doesn't care about your rules and your norms, and she's going to do what she wants, and that's fun. You get that actually in the Mirrorverse episodes of Deep Space Nine. You also have some queer characters.
Yeah, why is it's game on in the mirror universe for this sort of thing?
Everyone's
so why is it like that?
Great. Because you've got Kira, intending Kira, who is bisexual, and she actually has a kiss with the unjoined Ezri Tegan in a Mirror Universe episode in season 7.
Right. Which I think is the eighth ever lesbian kiss. The one in Rejoined is the 5th. So Trek has 2 on the board for the first 10 lesbian kisses on TV. That's worth something.
Points to Trek, but the reason this kind of exists is because when you've got antagonists, when you've got people who already have a license to do whatever they want because they are villains essentially, then you can make them do whatever they want. And there's, it's good and bad in showing queer people as part of that. It gives you a license to show queer people, but like, is that good or bad? So like this is the complex situation of the depraved bisexual. But what I adore about Rejoined is that it works so well as a lesbian story because of the taboo and because of the pining, and it reminds me a lot of scenes in Gentleman Jack, which I've been watching. But it's also inherently a bisexual story, which I only really realized when I rewatched this, because I was discussing it with a friend of mine who is also queer, and we have a lot of very in-depth discussions about Star Trek, and he said, oh, but it's not a queer story because she can be with other people. It's just this one person she can't be with. And I was like, it's a bi story. She can be with one type of person, but she can't be with another type of person, which makes it bisexual inherently as well. And I was like, that's neat. I don't think that's what they intended at all, but it's a fun dimension of the story.
Well, that's why I think that it can only work when the other person in the relationship is a woman, because we live in this world where they don't want to say it on screen or focus on it, but you can do whatever you want. There's no societal taboo against same-sex relationships, but then they introduce, in that great allegorical way that Trek does, this alien taboo that you can't reassociate, and so you put that thing in place that should be gone in their society. Like I can't believe that they didn't mean this, or I can't believe that they would downplay it. Even if it was 25 years ago, if I had come up with this, I would be spiking the football so hard, especially now. but they don't want to give themselves the check mark. So
yeah, I feel like they could discuss it more, but it has been like 25 years since it was on.
Well, yeah.
People still care about it, and it's also very much discussed. I mean, I obviously am very much in favour of this episode, and I think it works on multiple levels in terms of good queer representation, but there are a lot of people within sort of the queer Trek fan community that would disagree with me and would say that it doesn't work. Yeah, and the Outcast as well. The Outcast was hotly debated.
Well, like I said, maybe we didn't talk about the episode enough. Is there anything that you want to say still about the episode as we come to a close here?
I don't think so.
I think it's ultimately not to cut you off, but I think ultimately it's a very simple episode in terms of the plot, like what happens. It's no tacking into the wind or something like that, but yeah, as a character drama and seeing these characters experience this thing that means one thing in their universe but means something totally different in ours, I think it's really successful in what it tries to do.
I think so. I think it's a fantastic episode on so many levels, and like you said, Terry Farrell is like at her peak almost in this episode in showing the complexities of Jadzia's character, and I think it's to its credit that people still love that relationship so much that, like, I'll often see in fan discussions when they're talking about, like, who they wanted Dax to end up with, a lot of people are like, Kahn. They should have brought back Kahn. And in my head, I mean, something I would love to see, it would be very gratuitous and only for DS9 fans, but I would love to see the Trill explored more in the Picard show and other shows that catch up with the Federation decades later. But I would also like to see Dax, because Dax is still alive in a different host, and I would love something where it shows Dax and Khan also in different hosts, still in love, and being like, you know what, we're going to fight this. We're going to get together. I'd love to see that. I think a lot of people would.
I wanted to know why. So when Lenara comes to see Dax at this sort of like emotional sort of climax of the episode, she's doing sit-ups or something. Like Dax is she's doing some kind of yoga. I just wondered like why they made that like staging choice.
I hate that so much. I kind of didn't realize it until I rewatched it again before doing the podcast. I was like, why? What are they doing? The table's in the way, so you can't even see her do the sit-up.
Yeah, it's not even.
So
bizarre. Avery Brooks, come on.
Is it just to make her out of breath?
Or to make her vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like if they did that episode and she was or that scene and she was in her full science uniform or whatever. But she's like buttoned down and just seems more vulnerable. I guess her hair's down.
The costume and hair choices they made in that scene, flawless, absolutely gorgeous, love it. But that staging at the beginning, very strange. And all of the direction, I think, what we haven't talked about is Avery Brooks and how this was I believe his first episode that he directed, and I think I love everything he did with it, apart from that one little bit which was weird, because I think a lot of the shots, when you get them close up, and then there's a great one when they're in the Defiant and they're doing the science thing that is also happening, and Jadzia goes over to Lenara and they're kind of working on things and they're very close, and then you cut to her brother and the other scientist, and they're standing far apart.
Megamind and Dames Jaren, I think I've already established.
And they're standing far apart enough that in the background between the two of them, you see Jadzia and Lenara just get cozier and cozier, and I'm like, oh, that's a fun shot. So I think there's lots of little directorial flourishes. Actually, something I was going to say, which I forgot to say, was Megamind and those two. I think they're interesting because they operate as Trill society. They show that no matter how far you go, you're still caught within the trappings of that society, and they're there to reinforce that societal taboo, even though they've run from it. Because they are Trill, it still exists, and I was like, I like that.
And we never find out. I guess it's not important, but we never find out if they're joined or not. Every Trill character who is joined is going to come with their own baggage, because her brother then doesn't share either of her names. So I don't know if like unjoined Trill have one name and then you take the Trill name, and so she's just Lenara Kahn, but he does have two names. So is he a different symbiont, but is biologically her brother?
It could be either.
And it doesn't matter. It would have complicated the episode. Like, I'm glad we don't know, but just thinking about like what the relation is interesting to think about.
I mean, statistically speaking, he's almost definitely unjoined because there are so few joined.
Yeah, right.
And they do have a surname.
But you think he would let his sister do whatever she wants, even though it's a taboo, like, he cares about his sister, but he also knows that she's got this symbiont who's got to be wiser than I am. Maybe I don't know.
Oh,
what I'm
I mean,
talking about.
that's a fascinating dynamic to explore, which they kind of touched on with Esri. It's like if your sibling, especially like a younger sibling, we don't know which is older and which is younger, but like suddenly becomes this being that is older than you and wiser than you and is actually different personality-wise than the person you grew up with. That's going to give you a lot of issues. You're going to have a chip on your shoulder. You're going to have resentment. You're going to miss the person who used to exist before they came join, but like not be able to grieve for them because they're still there. It's really complicated, and the things that I liked about Esri were the family things. Because even though these were characters we'd just been introduced to and we didn't care about, I thought that those were interesting concepts to explore. So I think, and you can kind of see that in the dynamic between Lenara and her brother, in that it's contentious. Like, he's trying to control her, and possibly as a reaction to the fact that she is now older and wiser than him.
Yeah, which, like I said, it's just crazy, like, whether he's joined or not, like, the fact that the Trill care so much about their joined Trill and to sort of put them on a pedestal, the fact that he's just like, yeah, but you can't do that. It's like, whoa, come on.
Yeah.
For completing your second mission for the show, you'll receive a promotion to the rank of Lieutenant Junior Grade. And when you were on before, you said that you were working in the xenoanthropology department. How's that coming along?
Pretty good. I've had some issues with some Katarians. They're trying to take over the Federation in a coup again, but we managed to talk them out of it.
The Katarians are like the new Orion, I think.
Yeah.
The Orion are just like your go-to, we need some scumbags to do something. And then, of course, the Katarians, except for Naomi Wildman, like we only ever see Inara Joel try to take over the Enterprise with a holographic game.
Oh, that's such a weird episode.
Video games, yes. So bad for you. Something else that we probably should do a show on someday. But in any case, Lieutenant Tremeer, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISTPod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
I am at Extra Tremerial, which is supposed to sound like extraterrestrial, but just makes me sound extra, which is also kind of true. So that's me on Twitter. Otherwise, yeah, I guess that's kind of where I exist. Email me, maybe. Sure. Send a mail, a post.
Send her something by post,
yes.
By Royal Mail. And I will leave a link to your articles on IO9 and on Babel as well about the subjects we've talked about today.
Yeah, Polari is really, really interesting, and people, if they're interested, should pick up Tom Baker's new book, Fabulosa, because he conducted the bulk of the sort of research that means that we can understand Polari now. He already wrote a dictionary about it, and he did an academic book on it, which was, it's an academic book, so it was like £50, but he's now turned it into a regular book to be bought by the public, and it's incredible. If you're interested in the history, please buy it and follow him on the relevant channels.
Well, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me on board.
And we are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.